He is considered the foundational scriptwriter of the modern national comic. At the same time, he is recognized as one of the pillars of local science fiction. He and his creations symbolize struggle and open wounds. He and his family suffered the most atrocious horrors firsthand. Not those that came from an alien race, as his stories had predicted, but ones much more cruel, ones that would be born within the very stage of our society. The deadly snowfall he imagined occurred in 1963. However, the real hell would break loose in the mid-70s with the arrival of the civic military dictatorship to power. Today we are going to talk about the man who revolutionized contemporary narrative and also left a clear message for the future. Today we are going to accompany Juan Salvo through eternity. We were going to end up landing in a dark and gloomy January of 1978 to try to see through the mists of the day he died. Oesterheld. By the time he was kidnapped by a task group of the dictatorship in the middle of La Plata City, Oesterheld already knew that the sentence of a dark fate weighed on him. 2 of his daughters had already been murdered, and a few searches carried out in places he frequented had alerted him to the danger he was in. The 2nd of April, 1977. They intercepted him and forcibly put him into a vehicle that quickly disappeared into the shadows of the diagonals of the Buenos Aires capital, as could be reconstructed from the testimonies of survivors. The author of El Eternauta passed through the clandestine detention and torture centers of Campo de Mayo, Vesubio, and Geraton. It is believed that during his detention he endured relentless torture, just like the other prisoners. However, none of the blows were as strong as those given by the officers, who, after depriving him of water and food for days, presented themselves in front of him and with a ruthless smile boasted of having ended the lives of his other 2 daughters. Then, if all his daughters, 2 of them pregnant, had died, would their sons-in-law meet the same fate? Only one of the girls' bodies would be recovered, one of his grandsons would be saved, the same for his wife Elsa. But Oesterheld knew none of this at the moment, or maybe he came to imagine it. After all, his imagination could do anything. But the physical forces gradually left her, and although she did not give up, she knew that she could do little from that confinement from which she would not leave. Her health deteriorated progressively. Perhaps not so much due to the evident mistreatment, but, as we said, due to the injuries, the ones that ran inside, the impossible to heal. The last ones to see him alive were the survivors Javier Casareto, Arturo Chilida, and Juan Carlos Benitez, who had been kidnapped at the end of 1977 and remained in Vesuvius until mid-January of 1978. The 3 agreed that Oesterheld had his head bandaged and was in a deplorable state. The psychologist Eduardo Arias also shared captivity with the screenwriter. In 1983, Raúl Alfonsín created the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, with the aim of investigating human rights violations committed during the self-styled process of national reorganization. Eduardo Arias was interviewed and he told what is known as the last anecdote that has Oesterheld as the protagonist before he was no longer heard from. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before knowing what was the last gesture of the man to whom we owe the celebration of Comic Book Day in Argentina, let's see how it all started. Let's go back to the first panel. Hector Germán Oesterheld Pujol, son of a German and a Spaniard, was born on July 23, 1919. He graduated as a geologist at a young age, but rarely practiced the profession. His calling since childhood was unique. His insatiable curiosity was only comparable to his fascination with bringing to life the most varied and attractive scenarios. Oesterheld not only enjoyed listening to stories, but he lived generating them in his head. The leap from his mind to paper occurred when he decided to start writing children's stories and scientific dissemination works. He quickly realized his words had an impact on the audience. So, at the beginning of the 1950s, he turned to a genre that obsessed him, a genre that would make him famous, the adventure comic strip, and there he would leave an indelible mark. Oesterheld quickly found work at Editorial Abril, where he collaborated on Mysterix, the star magazine of the time. with a significant weekly circulation of 220,000 copies. Within the aforementioned magazine, Oesterheld was in charge of two highly successful comic strips, Sergeant Kirk and Bull Rocket, both featuring characters who, at the editorial request, had to go on adventures on American soil. Despite the reputation his scripts brought him, the author felt unsatisfied. He wanted national heroes who would take root in Argentine idiosyncrasy. Without much hesitation, it is then that he decides to form his own publishing house, for which he invites Hugo Pratt, Solano Lopez, and a few other illustrators with whom he was used to collaborating. Thus was born Editorial Frontera. The results: there would be no border for them. At Editorial Frontera, for example, Rollo, the adoptive Martian, a science fiction comic strip whose protagonist was a school teacher, was born. President of the neighborhood club and leader of the cafe's bar. In another magazine called Frontera, like the editorial, another endearing character, Joe Sonda, saw the light of day. A black-headed man from Mendoza's Chacras de Coria who had learned to do everything by correspondence, from assembling radios to piloting planes. These are just some of the examples. His imagination was vast and was nourished by the most unexpected situations. Everything was for him a trigger to start a new adventure. Broadly speaking, it should also be noted that almost all of Oesterheld's stories subtly criticized capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. Success again, the dissatisfaction of man again, who once again, following an impulse, decided to deliver his final blow. Tired of the monthly publications, he wondered what would happen if he dared to make a weekly magazine, in which he could finally get out all that was going around in his head. His surroundings told him he was crazy. The investment was huge, the possibilities of failure endless. Even so, Oesterheld, both solemn and defiant, affirmed that he would try. From that epiphany came Zero Hour Weekly, which quickly dethroned Mr. X. The public had decided that Oesterheld's projects were of higher quality and engaged them more deeply. At a certain point, a story was premiered in the magazine that caused the aforementioned 220,000 weekly copies, Mr. X, to be reduced to just 40,000. Everyone had switched their subscription to 0 Hour Weekly to follow the aforementioned story. The story was none other than the Eternaut. In an interview years before his kidnapping, Oesterheld explained how the idea for his most famous comic strip emerged. The Eternaut. It started as a short story of just 70 frames. Then it turned into a long story, a sort of adaptation of the Robinson Crusoe theme. I was fascinated by the idea of a family left alone in the world, surrounded by death and an unknown and unreachable enemy. He reflected on himself and his family, secluded in their chalet, which led him to introspection. The first installment of The Eternaut was released in 1957. It was promoted as the story of the man who comes back, from the future who has seen everything. The death of our generation, the final destiny of the planet. The Eternaut story starts in Buenos Aires. A man arrives at the home of German, a comic book writer claiming to be Juan Salvo, the Eternaut. A man trapped in space, looking for a way to save his family from a tragedy. Salvo says that the ordeal of humanity has a specific origin. A strange radioactive snowfall falls on the city and kills everyone it reaches. The dilemma is clear: what to do? Accept the isolation or go out in search of answers. It was the times of the liberating revolution, and the comic strip in some way conveyed a certain climate that was articulated with that of the time. Solano Lopez, the illustrator of the work, always said that neither he nor Oesterheld thought that first version of the Eternaut with some political intention. However, the same would not happen a few years later. Over time, the Eternaut would have other versions. In them, especially the one from 1976, the political content was already manifest. At that time, was there some friction between the illustrator and the scriptwriter? And it's that by that time, Oesterheld was no longer the same. Hector had followed his daughters in their militancy in Montoneros, and even had been part of the executive committee of the newspaper Noticias, where he also published a daily strip, The War of the Antartes. In 1968, he declared himself moved by Eva Peroni. Along with Alberto and Enrique Breccia, He had published a biography of Che Guevara, a biography that, after taking its first steps, had been promptly kidnapped and destroyed. He wrote the scripts for parts 2 and 3 of the Eternaut from the most absolute secrecy. The subversive and militant content of the work was more than evident, which made his inner circle uneasy. It seemed impossible that the pacifist and democratic writer had taken sides with something so violent, Elsa, his wife, would say later, with a hint of complaint. Then she would underline with pain. In the first years of marriage, I felt that we achieved happiness and fulfillment, but I had the premonition that something terrible was going to happen to us. And indeed, it would be so. The premonition would come true with heartbreaking punctuality. Oesterheld felt he had a debt to his own youth, a time when he had lived secluded among books, without active participation in politics or social matters. What contributed to his choice of armed struggle in the dramatic context of the dictatorship? "How did you get the courage to take the leap?" a friend once asked him. "For my daughters?" he would respond. Daughters who, as we already mentioned, and just like him, would not survive that disastrous time. In her last years, Elsa was actively involved in the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo and always stayed close to the 2 grandchildren she raised. She died in 2015 at the age of 90. She always had hopes of finding her daughter's missing children. Now, having said that, let's move back in time and pick up the moment with which we started this report. It was at the end of December 1977, when Oesterheld had been a prisoner for 8 months. When the guards allowed him and psychologist Arias to remove their hoods, they gave them a cigarette as a Christmas gift, as well as a few minutes to fraternize and talk. At that moment, Hector expressed that being the oldest of all the prisoners, he wanted to greet each and every one of those present there, in the same kidnapping situation as him. And so it was, badly hurt and dragging the pain caused by the certainty of knowing the other members of his family were dead. He gave a strong and warm handshake to each of the people present, looking them in the eyes. With that act, he made clear his ideas, his conviction that only unity could bring hope to humanity. Had he ever said young and ignorant of what awaited him? The challenge is for us to create a comic strip with new content and values. For example, a hero who sees things from a different point of view, or who must necessarily act in collaboration with other characters. In this way, without saying it, in our stories we can introduce the notion of people, of common and supportive people, ultimately, of the collective hero. When they were kidnapped, Oesterheld was 58 years old. The specific day of his death could never be determined, nor was his body recovered. Some dared to dream that he, like Juan Salvo, had ended up lost in space-time, looking for a way to reverse everything that had happened. Simply put, not only to save himself, but also to save us.